the official record of what happened at the Tatum family settlement on the headwaters of the Tallahassee Creek in Jones County, Mississippi in the late winter of 1888 fits on 2 pages. The first page is a report filed by the Jones County Sheriff, a man named Albert Perkins, on March 3, 1888, describing his visit to the settlement following a complaint from a timber buyer named Frederick Greer who had traveled the creek road 3 weeks earlier and had found the settlement unoccupied. The second page is the circuit court's acknowledgment of the report, which notes the matter, assigns it a docket number, and records that no further action was taken pending the appearance of family members or any other person with information about the settlement's former occupants. No family member appeared, no person with information appeared. The docket has been open in the technical sense since March 1888. 14 people had lived at the Tatum settlement in January 1888 by the most recent count available in the county's records. Nathan Tatum's wife Heath, their 4 children, Nathan's older brother Decatur with his household of 3, and 4 additional individuals whose relationship to the main family the county records described variously as laborers, boarders, and in one case simply as connected to the Tatum household. The settlement had been established in the early 1870s on a section of the upper Tallahassee headwaters where the creek narrowed between 2 low ridges in the pine flatwoods of central Jones County. It was remote in the specific way that the Jones County piney woods made things remote, not the mountain isolation of Appalachian hollows or the deep drainage isolation of Ozark River country, but the flat, dense, featureless isolation of the southern longleaf pine ecosystem, where travel in any direction produced more of the same terrain and the distances between settlements were real distances in a landscape that gave your eyes nothing to measure them against. Before we begin, drop your location in the comments and tell me what time it is where you are. 14 people, the upper Tallahassee Creek in Jones County, Mississippi, late winter of 1888. I want to know where you are sitting when you hear what Sheriff Perkins found and what the 4 documents assembled for this account describe. The specific character of the upper Tallahassee Creek country in Jones County is worth establishing before reaching the settlement itself because the terrain shapes both the settlement's isolation and the disappearance documentary silence. The Tallahassee Creek and its tributaries ran through the longleaf pine flatwoods of central Jones County, terrain that was distinct in character from both the hill country to the north and the coastal plain to the south, a landscape of sandy soil, pine and scrub oak, creek drainages that ran low in summer and rose unpredictably in wet seasons, and the particular navigational difficulty of a landscape that looked the same in every direction, and where the landmarks were subtle enough that an unfamiliar traveler could lose their way with disturbing ease. The communities in the upper Tallahassee country were self-contained in a way that was specific to that terrain, not the mountain isolation of Appalachian hollows, where the terrain imposed itself visibly and dramatically, but the flat, dense, featureless isolation of pine flatwoods that imposed itself invisibly by making everything look accessible while providing no reliable orientation. The Tatum settlement had been in the flatwoods for 15 years and had developed the particular self-sufficiency that the terrain required. Jones County, Mississippi in 1888 had a specific character that distinguished it from the deep south of cotton agriculture and plantation memory. It was a county of small farmers and subsistence agriculture and the piney woods timber economy, a county whose population was predominantly white, predominantly poor, and predominantly descended from the upland South settlers who had come to the southern Mississippi piney woods in the early 19th century looking for land that the plantation economy had not yet claimed. It had been, during the Civil War, a county of notably ambivalent Confederate loyalty. The famous Free State of Jones mythology exaggerated a real phenomenon, which was a county that had provided significant resistance to Confederate conscription, and that had spent the war in the particular condition of divided community loyalty that the Appalachian and upland South counties knew well. By 1888, 20 years after the war, Jones County was in the condition of a community that had survived its internal divisions and was focused on the practical business of making a living in difficult terrain with limited resources. The Tatum settlement was, by the accounts available in the county records, a self-sufficient and functional community, small, isolated, organized around the 2 Tatum brothers' households and a few associated individuals, managing a modest farming and timber operation on the upper Tallahassee. Sheriff Perkins described it in his March 1888 report as a well-kept property, showing evidence of recent occupation and regular work. This is the same description that appears in the reports of virtually every sheriff who arrives at an abandoned settlement in this series: the intact property, the evidence of recent occupation, the absence of the people who maintained it. What distinguishes the Tatum settlement from the other disappearance cases in this series is the condition of the main house. In every other settlement's appearance in this collection, the North Carolina Blue Ridge, the Georgia Cove, the Tennessee Creek Bottom, the Alabama Limestone Country, the structures were found with doors standing open, or meals on tables, or gardens half-tended, or some other detail that suggested an interrupted ordinary morning. The Tatum main house was found with its door standing open and no evidence of disturbance, consistent with the rest of the pattern, except for one detail that Perkins noted in his report and that the county records describe in a way that had not appeared in any of the other cases in this series. The interior walls of the main house, Perkins wrote, had been written on, not graffiti in any conventional sense, not the kind of marking that travelers or vandals might make on an abandoned structure, writing that covered the interior walls of 2 rooms from floor to ceiling in a hand that the county clerk who accompanied Perkins on a second visit described as regular and deliberate, the script of a person who was writing with purpose rather than haste. The writing was in English. Perkins and the clerk between them could read most of it. They could not, by the time they finished reading it, agree on what to do with what they had read. The circuit court record in Laurel contains 2 documents beyond the standard report: a statement from Perkins filed in April 1888, 3 weeks after his first report, which he titled Additional Observations Regarding the Tatum Settlement, and in which he described the wall writing in more detail, and a letter from the circuit court judge to the state attorney general's office in Jackson, filed in May 1888, requesting guidance on how to handle the documentation of the case. The state attorney general's office responded in June 1888 with a brief acknowledgment that noted the matter and recommended that the county treat the wall writing as evidence in the open docket, photograph it if possible, and preserve the structure pending further information. The photography was not done. There is no photograph of the wall writing in the Jones County records. The structure stood until a timber operation cleared the site in 1903. The wall writing went with the structure. Perkins filed his additional statement 3 weeks after his first visit, which means he spent 3 weeks thinking about the wall writing before he decided to put anything about it in the official record. 3 weeks for a sheriff who was a methodical record keeper by his own prior documentation, between visiting a site and deciding to write an additional statement about something he had seen there. Whatever that 3 weeks contained, the conversations he had or didn't have with the clerk who had accompanied him, the decisions about what the record should contain and what it should not, is not documented anywhere. What exists is the additional statement filed in April 1888 and its careful characterization of writing that covered 200 square feet of wall surface and became harder to follow in its later sections. The additional statement is Perkins choosing, after 3 weeks of consideration, to put something in the official record that he had not put in the first report. It is the record of a man deciding that the record should contain this, despite his uncertainty about what the appropriate form for its content was. He decided the record required it. The record contains it. The wall writing the record describes is gone. The specific condition of the writing, regular and deliberate, organized into a narrative structure, means the writer was not in acute crisis when they wrote it. Crisis produces disorganized writing, the changes in pressure, the abandoned sentences, the words that bleed into each other when a hand is trembling. What Perkins described was the opposite of that. This was organized. This was purposeful. This was a person who had decided to write a record of what they had observed, and who had written it in the careful, sustained way that a person writes when they are writing something they want to be legible and clear and preservable. They wrote 200 square feet of walls. They wrote from the beginning through a middle to an end. The end was on the north wall of the rear room, where what was being described became more difficult for Perkins and the clerk to follow. The final sections, harder to follow, read twice, not discussed afterward. This was not panic. This was documentation. The writer documented something in the last document they apparently produced, and then the settlement was empty, and then Frederick Greer came up the creek road 3 weeks later and found the Tatum settlement in good order, with nobody in it and the door standing open. What Perkins' additional statement describes is the following. The writing covered the 2 main rooms of the house, approximately 200 square feet of wall surface in total. It was in a single hand, consistent throughout, suggesting it had been written by one person. The content was organized in a way that suggested a deliberate narrative structure, not a list, not a prayer, not a formulaic repetition of the kind that psychological distress sometimes produces, but a connected account of something that the writer was describing in order. Perkins wrote, "The writing appears to be a record of observations made by the writer over a period of time, documenting what they had seen and heard in the settlement in the period immediately preceding its abandonment. The record is detailed and specific in its earlier sections and becomes less legible in its later sections, not because the handwriting changes, but because what is being described becomes more difficult to follow. The final sections of the writing, on the north wall of the rear room, describe events and conditions that I was unable to interpret, and that the clerk was also unable to interpret. We read it twice. We have not discussed it with each other since. The final sections describe events and conditions that two men read twice and did not discuss afterward. There is an element of the Tatum settlement's history that the accessible record does not address, and that is worth noting for the light it sheds on the writing's existence, who wrote it, and when. Perkins' report establishes that the writing was present when his search party arrived in early March 1888, and that it was in a hand described as regular and deliberate, the script of a person writing with purpose rather than haste. This means the writing was done before the settlement was abandoned, by someone who was still in the settlement, in a state calm enough to produce regular and deliberate handwriting across 200 square feet of wall surface. The writing was not the product of distress in the usual sense. It was the product of sustained effort, organized into a narrative structure, covering the full available writing surface of 2 rooms. Whoever wrote it spent a significant amount of time writing it. They did so while still in the settlement. They wrote a record of observations made over a period of time, and then, at some point after the writing was complete, the settlement was empty. The 4 documents assembled for this account are Perkins' March 1888 report and April 1888 additional statement, both in the Jones County Circuit Court records in Laurel, the Circuit Court Judge's May 1888 letter to the Attorney General's office in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History in Jackson, and a brief account in the Laurel Leader-Call newspaper from March 1888, which reported the discovery of the abandoned settlement in 2 paragraphs, and noted that the sheriff's investigation was ongoing. None of these documents reproduce the content of the wall writing. Perkins chose not to reproduce it in his additional statement, noting that he was not confident that a written reproduction in a legal document was the appropriate form for the content. The circuit court judge, in his letter to the Attorney General's office, described the wall writing as a document whose full description I am choosing to reserve pending further guidance from your office, as I am uncertain what legal framework, if any, applies to it. A document whose full description the judge was choosing to reserve. The Attorney General's office responded with a procedural recommendation, and the matter went no further. The structure stood for 15 more years. The writing was on the walls when the timber operation cleared the site in 193. Nobody photographed it. Nobody transcribed it. When the structure was demolished or cleared, the writing went with it, and the only description of its content is what Perkins wrote about it in April 1888 and what the clerk would have said if anyone had asked him. But the clerk's account is not in any record that has been found. There is one final element of the documentary record that the 4 assembled documents contain, and that has not been addressed, which is the fate of the settlement's property after 1888. The Open Circuit Court docket has a notation in the 1890 records indicating that the Jones County Probate Court initiated a determination of death for the Tatum family members to clear the title to the settlement's land. The determination was granted in 1891, 3 years after the disappearance, after no family members had appeared and no information had been received. The land was sold at public auction in 1892 and subsequently passed through several owners before being absorbed into a larger agricultural holding in the early 20th century. There is nothing unusual about this chain of events. It is the standard administrative processing of an abandoned estate following a disappearance without a body. What is notable is the probate court's efficiency. 3 years was apparently the threshold at which Jones County was prepared to formally declare 14 people dead in the absence of any evidence of how they had died or where. The docket is still technically open in the circuit court records in Laurel. The probate determination closed the estate. The docket is a different record from a different court and has never been formally closed, because no resolution was ever entered into it, because no resolution was ever found. 14 people, the upper Tallahassee Creek, 200 square feet of writing that 2 men read twice and did not discuss afterward. The final sections describe something that a Jones County sheriff and a Jones County clerk could not interpret. The content is gone with the structure. The description of the content is in Laurel and in Jackson. The docket has been open since March 1888. Here is the question that the Tatum settlement leaves behind, and it is the hardest version of the question that appears in every settlement disappearance case in this series. In every other case, the Georgia Cove, the Tennessee Creek, the Alabama Limestone Country, The North Carolina Blue Ridge, the settlement was found intact but empty, and the question was, where did they go and why? The Tatum settlement was found intact and empty too, but with writing on the walls. The writing was a record of observations. The observations became harder to follow in the later sections. The final sections described events and conditions that two experienced county officials read twice and then did not discuss with each other. They read it and did not discuss it. That is the detail this case provides that the others do not. Most disappearances leave only the absence. This one left an account. The account is gone, but the testimony that two men read it and then chose not to discuss it with each other is still there in Perkins' additional statement, available to any researcher who requests the file in Laurel. The upper Tallahassee Creek headwaters in Jones County, Mississippi are today a mixture of private agricultural land and managed pine timber production. The longleaf pine flatwoods have been largely replaced by managed loblolly pine stands, as they have across most of the southern Mississippi coastal plain, but the creek itself still runs through the same drainage it has always run through, and the general topography of the headwaters area where the Tatum settlement was located is described in the county's soil survey records and accessible to anyone who studies the relevant section of the county land map. The site of the Tatum settlement was cleared in 1903 when the timber operation came through. Whether any physical trace of the settlement remains visible at the surface, foundations, cleared areas, the geometry of former fields would require a visit to determine. The Jones County Circuit Court records in Laurel are accessible through standard request procedures. The Mississippi Department of Archives and History in Jackson holds the Circuit Court correspondence. The Laurel Leader Call Archive, accessible through the Mississippi Press Archives Project, contains the two-paragraph newspaper account from March 1888. What do you think Nathan Tatum or whoever wrote on those walls was describing? What does it take for two professional officials to read a document twice and then choose silence over discussion? Tell me in the comments what you think is in the final sections of the writing on the north wall of the rear room. Tell me whether you think Perkins knew what he was describing when he said the content became harder to follow. If these settlement reports and additional statements and judges' letters to attorney general's offices and the walls of structures that were cleared before anyone photographed what was on them are the reason you found this channel, subscribe and ring the bell. Perkins' additional statement is in the Jones County Circuit Court records in Laurel, in the same file as the March 1888 report. The judge's letter is in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History in Jackson, in the incoming correspondence of the State Attorney General's Office for 1888. The probate determination declaring the Tatum family members dead is in the Jones County Probate Court records, also in Laurel, dated 1891. 3 years after the disappearance, 14 people officially dead by administrative determination without a body or an explanation, because 14 people had been missing for 3 years and the administrative machinery required a resolution. The open circuit court docket, in the same building as the probate records, required no resolution and received none. It is technically open. The docket number from March 1888 is still active in the Jones County Circuit Court records, unresolved, in a building in Laurel, where the Perkins additional statement and the judge's letter and the probate determination are all within a few hundred yards of each other. 14 people, officially dead since 1891. The docket still open, the writing on the walls gone since 1903, the record containing everything the people who made it chose to put into it, which is not the same as everything there was. Perkins chose to put the wall writing in the additional statement. He chose not to transcribe it. He chose to say it became harder to follow. He chose to say they had not discussed it. That sequence of choices is what the record preserved. That sequence of choices by a Jones County sheriff in 1888 is what makes the docket worth keeping open. The writing is gone. 2 men read it twice. They have not discussed it with each other since. That is what the record preserved. That is what the record will always preserve.